Bills Mafia. On tonight's Air Raid Hour, we will be breaking down all things wide receivers in the 2024 NFL Draft. Our focus will be on the impact of the additions this week of Curtis Samuel and Mack Hollins, as well as the Buffalo Bills' new approach, possibly, to the wide receiver position in the draft. Plus, what receivers we expect to go in which rounds and who we expect to be available to us when, who provides the best value, etc. So let's get into it. But first,
welcome to the Air Raid Hour, a Cover One Network podcast. Here are your hosts, Judge Mathis and Tilt Money.
welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to the Air Raid Hour presented by Picasso's Pizza and the Cover One Sports Network. My name is Steve Mathis. You can find me on X at the Bills Guys. Joined as always by my co-host Dave Tilton. You can find him on X at Tilt Money. And tonight, Dave, we get to do what everyone in Bills Mafia, it seems, wants to do right now, and that is to break down this 2024 wide receiver class. And as we do it, we're going to talk about where we expect players to get drafted, where we think the best value lies, which players we like the most, and hopefully the comment section will bring it as well, and they'll be given their points of view on all these various different wide receivers. But before we get started, we got to sort of reset the wide receiver room because the Buffalo Bills made two additions to the room this week in Mack Hollins and Curtis Samuel. The big one obviously being Curtis Samuel. So let's start there. 3-year deal, $24 million in total. That's an $8 million average annual value, $15 million guaranteed. With incentives, he can bring it up to $30 million. So a pretty lucrative contract for the still very young playmaker, Curtis Samuel, who's obviously got experience with Joe Brady when he was with the Carolina Panthers. Your thoughts on this move?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's no secret in the Cover One group chat, and obviously, I haven't necessarily been down on Curtis Samuel, the player. I am a big fan of him as a player. I think it's always a positive to add weapons to the room. But the question now becomes, or like, I guess the onus now is on Joe Brady, right? On how to use Curtis Samuel in this offense. And I know Eric and Anthony have been doing a really great job over the past week, sort of cutting up clips and showing where Samuel has been most effective, right? In some of his previous stints, whether that's in the slot where he's played most of the past 3 seasons, even though seasons prior to that, he played predominantly on the outside. So in recent years, he's been mainly a slot guy. In the course of his career, it's been a pretty even split. It is now up to Joe Brady to figure out how to best utilize Curtis Samuel while also still maximizing what he can get out of a guy like Khalil Shakir. So I know a lot of Bills fans were hoping for like a boundary type of guy, like a T. Higgins, like even though it was probably far-fetched, but love the player. Now it's on Joe Brady in my mind. That's kind of where I land on this.
Yeah, I mean, I love the player as well. When we talked about free agency, we hardly ever mentioned Curtis Samuel. And the reason why we didn't mention Curtis Samuel is, just as you mentioned, it's now going to be up to Joe Brady to sort of figure out how to get him snaps, how to get Khalil Shakir snaps. I shouldn't even say snaps. I should say targets, and how he's going to utilize all those guys. But when you think about it, Curtis Samuel has had his most career success under Joe Brady. He now gets to play with Joe Brady again. So he is now with the guy who has sort of tapped the most potential out of him. You get another guy who's just straight up a playmaker. And what I like about Curtis Samuel, and what's really sold me on Curtis Samuel over the past couple of days, because I've really started to sort of dig in to him now that he is actually a Buffalo Bill, he's just a natural separator, right? Like we talk about, what did Josh Allen need? We talked about boundary bodies. We talked about high point catchers. We talked about field stretching abilities. But another word that we threw in there in traits that we'd like to see in the wide receiver room is we wanted to see the Buffalo Bills go out and get natural separators. So whether
Mhm.
it's NFL Next Gen Stats posting advanced analytics, or it's reception perception, Matt Harmon, who literally studies wide receivers for a living, they both posted a lot of really interesting data. You can go follow the Bills guys on social media. I shared that data, and all of that data was just about how good of a separator, how good Curtis Samuel is at getting open. And that is something that Josh Allen has sort of lacked over the last couple of years. The Buffalo Bills have lacked those natural separators. So now having a natural separator and Curtis Samuel in the room is going to just, I think, work wonders.
Yeah, and that's obviously a huge asset to stylistically how Josh Allen plays and right and what has really benefited him the most over the course of his career when he's been the most effective.
Mhm,
Um, Look, I think that it fits in that sense stylistically, right? But I
mhm,
think then there might need to be some creativity then with formations, personnel alignments. Maybe you see a little bit more four wide from
mhm,
the Bills this year. Maybe you see them like people have been clamoring for that 12 personnel, but maybe you actually you see them with a little bit more spread, like with
mhm,
this, and you see like a double slot situation with Shakir and Samuel. We'll see how the rest of the offseason plays out, who else they might add. But
mhm.
yeah, I think kind of like how we were talking about Ken Dorsey being a year sort of into his job a year ago and
Mhm.
figuring out the best way to kind of become and kind of blossom as a play caller with the weapons he had. It's again, I'll come back to it's on Joe Brady now to say,
Yeah.
okay, yes, you're a separator. Maybe this leads to some more easy layup type of throws for Josh.
Yeah, and then looking at, again, piecing this wide receiver core together, right? It's not just about going out and getting the 5 or 6 best guys. Sometimes it's about mixing and matching and making sure you have different traits. And one of the things that we talked about is you got to replace Gabriel Davis's ability to go and get after it in the run game. You
Mm,
need to replace Gabriel Davis's ability to be that bigger body on the boundary. You need to there are things that Gabriel Davis did that, even though you don't agree that a number 2 receiver should do those things, you still need a wide receiver capable of doing those things in your wide receiver room. And the Buffalo Bills got that in Mack Hollins, who signed a 1-year $2.6 million deal. He's another guy that we really didn't touch on in our free agency preview shows. I thought the Bills were going to try to go younger in the room. He's a little bit older at 29 years of age, but he's been a captain on 3 teams he's played for. He's got obviously a huge, bigger body at 6'4", 200 something pounds. So he's got what you're looking for in terms of the boundary. And Eric and Ant have already started breaking down films, and they just show how he gets after it in the run game in terms of blocking people. He plays special teams. Mack Hollins is a guy who was a 4th-round pick who he's earned it the hard way in the National Football League, and he's stuck in the NFL for years and years and years by doing all the little things correct. So what are your thoughts on this Mack Hollins signing?
Well, one, I mean, you have to give credit to Matt Collins. There's a reason he's been in
Mhm,
the NFL, and is even though his receiving numbers, although 2 years ago they were pretty decent with
mhm,
Vegas, he sticks around on teams because of his effort and because of his size and his ability to block in the run game. He certainly gives you more than Trent Sherfield in that
mhm,
regard, as far as like the blend of what he can give you in the run game and what he can give you as a threat really in the passing game, right? We probably overestimated what Trent Sherfield
mhm,
could be in the passing game, not really expecting, nor should we expect a ton of Mack Hollins in the passing game. I don't think at this juncture, but
mhm,
he has shown the ability to do that when called upon. So at this stage, Mack Hollins as a 5th or 6th receiver, who can really get after it in the run game as a blocker on the perimeter, like it's a good signing, and he definitely gives you
mhm,
sort of that balance with the 2 signings. We just talked about Samuel. Mack Hollins kind of like balances out that signing. So now, like, while
yeah,
he isn't a premier perimeter receiver, he does give you some of that perimeter size and what you needed to replacing Gabe Davis in the running game.
mhm.
So obviously it's not a 1-for-1, but it does give you again a little bit of balance with those 2 signings, and it kind of opens you up a little bit more for what you can do in the draft.
Yeah, we got a couple of comments here. We got our guy Mitchell Broder in the comments. He says, How early do the Bills draft a wide receiver with Samuel and Mack Hollins in the fold? Do you think they should still draft one in round one? And then we have Justin Tyndall coming into the super chat. Always appreciate the super chats. Thank you, Justin. He says trade down 67 picks until we are on the board after round two. Cross players off the board who you think can't be number one wide receivers. This is the draft where we have to go out and find Diggs's long-term replacement. And I like both of those comments because it sort of brings me into the next sort of topic here before we start tiering these wide receivers. Let's take a look at the wide receiver room the Buffalo Bills currently have. It's Stephon Diggs, who is your number one. Curtis Samuel, I took a lot of heat for labeling him as like a depth, like wide receiver 4 in a post I made earlier this week. So Curtis Samuel, wide receiver 2. Khalil Shakir, wide receiver 3. Currently on the roster, as is, Mack Hollins would be your wide receiver 4. And then you'd have guys like Justin Shorter, KJ Hamler, Andy Isabella, Tyrell Shavers, Brian Thompson, all sort of battling for the final 2 positions. You would think that the Buffalo Bills would still add another wide receiver in the draft, but how do they approach it now? Do they just try to fit maybe pieces into the puzzle in this wide receiver room? Do they go all out for an alpha? Does this take slot receivers off the board? How does this affect the way the Buffalo Bills approach the draft? Because there are a number of ways you can sort of take this.
Well, look, I mean, the Bills had Khalil Shakir, and they weren't afraid to go out and sign Curtis Samuel, right? Because of what kind of skill sets he had and his ability to separate. So, to be honest, you would think that this does take slot off the board. You still have a guy who's relatively young, who was a second rounder in KJ Hamler in the fold. You have now Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel, who are really primary slot guys, you would think. You have Mack Hollins, the opposite of Stephon Diggs, but you don't really necessarily have that opposite perimeter receiving threat. You would think the Bills would be targeting more someone in the draft who was more of that boundary receiving threat, body control, go up and get it type of player. But I thought they would do that in free agency as well. And I think we have to look at this a little bit bigger picture. You just named the top 4 guys, and it's still pretty thin, right? Like it's a thin group overall, top to bottom. So I think because of that, any profile type of player could be on the board for the Bills at some point in this draft, because in reality, you really only have, I would say, those 4 guys that you can truly count on. TBD what Justin Shorter can bring you, if KJ Hamler can get over some of his injuries. There's just a lot of question marks beyond those top 4.
Walter S. comes in and says, I feel like if anything, the Samuel signing more so narrows down the type of wide receiver we're looking for with our first selection. I feel like a guy like Ladd McConkey is off the board as a first selection. I think logic would tell you that, right? Like, all right, now we're in Brian Thomas Jr., Adnai Mitchell, Keon Coleman, Xavier Legette. That's the type of receiver, maybe even a Troy Franklin, because he will play the boundary and can stretch the field. Javon Baker. It's like, oh, we can start to limit and we can sort of maybe start to figure out what kind of receiver the Buffalo Bills are going to look for. But logic would tell you that, right? And we as fans, we only have an outside perspective. So we just look at it from a logical perspective. But the Buffalo Bills could have a completely different mindset. I made this post on social media yesterday, and Ladd McConkey fits into this as well. Ladd McConkey and Ricky Pierce all fit into this as well. I can see the Buffalo Bills absolutely falling in love with a wide receiver that doesn't fit the mold of what we expect them to draft now. Roman Wilson was the example I gave. Roman Wilson gives me very much like Amon-Ra St. Brown vibes. He has a little bit of inside. He has a lot of inside ability, a little bit of outside ability, can stretch the field, good speed, good. He's a little on the smaller side, so a little smaller than Amon-Ra St. Brown, but he's a tough son of a gun. He gets after it in the run game. I think he could be a sleeper, be a guy drafted at the tail end of the first round, or a trade back candidate, or a guy we trade up in the second round to go and get. It would make, like, right now, looking at this receiver room, a guy like Ladd McConkey or a guy like Roman Wilson, it doesn't make any sense. You're like, no, we got to get a bigger body guy, a boundary guy, a field stretching guy like this, and this. But at the end of the day, the Buffalo Bills might just be in effort mode. And they're like, let's just go get 4 stud receivers. We can just mix and match and move them all around. And when we need to get after it in the run game, we got Mack Hollins and we got Justin Shorter and we got tight ends. We can go 12 personnel. We're just going to go find who we think are the 4 best receivers. Because I think in free agency, they went after who they thought was the best receiver in Curtis Samuel, even though we felt like there's a lot of intertwining with what Khalil Shakir does. They were just like, no, he's the best receiver. Let's go get him. The draft could be the same way.
Yeah, and I think that we often have discussion. The logic comment you made was
Mhm.
perfect, right? Because we often have the discussion of trying to fit these pieces into the puzzle, right? And like who will fit best into what the Bills' apparent needs are, right? From
Yeah.
a profile perspective for a certain type of position. And maybe we need to start thinking about it more on who do they think the best player is at that
Mhm.
position, regardless. And I think if you do that, you maybe more often would be successful, and
Mhm.
that ends up being more of a coaching. Um, the onus is then on the coaching more so than it is on the
Mhm.
player necessarily. So you go out and you get the best talent, figure out a way to use them because that's the job of the coaching staff is to figure out how to use these players. And Joe Brady's gonna have to do that with Samuel, as we already mentioned. That would mean to me, like, all things equal, they're gonna take the best guy, even if maybe on the surface it maybe
Mhm.
doesn't look like that's the most obvious need. I don't think that's a bad approach, to be honest. I think it's a good approach with where the Bills roster is right now.
All right, so we're going to get into it now. We are going to go through the draft board. And we're going to start with who we think the first round receivers are, and we're going to work our way all the way to like the double dip candidates, the receivers that could be available in round 6, round 7, even some undrafted guys that we might like. But before we do, this show is brought to you by Picasso's Pizza, 4 great locations in Williamsville, West Seneca, Lancaster, and Blaisdell. Buffalo Pizza. Since 1980, you can order online at picassospizza.net. And if you're an out of towner like us, you can even get it mailed to your home. And we can tell you from experience, it is just as good as getting it fresh from the restaurant. Again, that is picassospizza.net. So when the Buffalo Bills go and they take a defensive tackle in the first round, or they take they trade back, and take a safety with their first pick, or they take an edge rusher, you can just go get some Picasso's pizza and you can eat your feelings about it. Cause I think a lot of people in Bills Mafia are expecting the Buffalo Bills or want the Buffalo Bills to take a wide receiver in the first round. Before we get into this exercise tonight, we do this every year and we're doing it just a little bit differently this year because I'm a little bit more maybe prepared than I have been in years past. In years past, we would sit here for about 3 hours and we would like tier the board together. And it would be a long, arduous thought experiment. And we would do it with the help of the comment section. We're trying to be a little bit more efficient with our time this year. So I have already gone through and I have already tiered the wide receivers. So what the exercise tonight is going to be is Dave reacting to it, us talking about who's in each of these tiers, you guys reacting to it, you guys talking about your favorite value and your favorite players in each tiers. And if you disagree with me and where I have a wide receiver slotted, feel free to let us know in the comment section. But what I've done is essentially, this isn't my opinion. This isn't Dave's opinion. This is where we think these players will go in the draft. So I might think Javon Baker is, I would love Javon Baker in a certain place, but I might place him in a different place in this exercise. And we've gotten pretty good over the years
Mhm.
of figuring out where guys are going to be drafted. It's not perfect, but I do think that we are better than some of the simulators out there. And we have predicted where guys will be drafted better than the simulators have in years past. I remember getting in arguments with people over Cam Jurgens, over Luke Fortner, over Tyquan Thornton, guys that we said, hey, these are going to be like day 2 guys. Or we talked about Felix Anazuke, the defensive end. We're like, he could go in the end of the first round, and the Chiefs took him at the
Alma,
very
yeah,
last pick of the draft.
yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah.
I think we've become pretty good at this exercise. So that's what we're going to do this evening. And we're going to start with our tier 1 wide receivers. And those tier 1 wide receivers are as follows: Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, and the latest addition to the tier 1 wide receivers after his combine, Brian Thomas Jr. These are the guys that I think are stone cold first round locks. The first 3, no duh. I don't expect any of those 3 to even be remotely available to the Buffalo Bills, even if we could trade up into like the early teens. I still think that all 3 of these guys will be off the board in the first probably 10 to 12
Yep.
picks. Brian Thomas Jr. is the most interesting one. Is he worth the Buffalo Bills making a move if he's sitting there in the early 20s?
Hmm. I I would say no, and
Hmm.
I'll probably get disagreements on that. And the reason I say no is because of a few things. Number one, the Bills don't have a third round pick. We expected them
Hmm.
to get that comp pick from the Tremaine Edmonds signing, and we didn't get it. Right, we got the fourth rounder. The Bills only have 2 picks in the first 3 rounds, so that's
Hmm.
reason number one. I say no. Reason number two, as we're going to see throughout the night tonight, a lot of wide receiver talent in this draft. And I don't personally believe
Hmm.
I would almost put like Brian Thomas in a 1A behind
Yeah.
those first 3 guys.
So a couple of people have mentioned this too. So Charles G comes in and says BTJ and AD Mitchell the next tier. I agree from a talent perspective. So the way that I tiered this is not necessarily from a talent perspective. It's from where they'll be drafted.
Hmm.
So I think that these 4 guys are stone cold locks. I cannot envision a world where the 4 of these guys escape the first round.
Yep.
And then you'll see guys like Lad McConkey, Adney Mitchell, Xavier Worthy. They're in tier 2 because I can see any of those guys, those 5 guys, going in round 1, but I think that their floor is I don't think they escape round 2. So that's how I categorize them, not so much on their talent, because I think the first 3 are head and shoulders above Brian
Hmm.
Thomas Jr. and in a different talent tier. I tiered them by where I expect them to be drafted.
And exactly what you just said, and that
Mhm.
explanation is why I don't is reason number two, basically why I don't think the
Yeah.
Bills should trade up for Brian Thomas. So that in combination with their lack of a third round pick, the depth of this wide receiver class, I say
Mhm.
no to trading up for Brian Thomas. I could maybe be talked into trading up for something else, but like I'm not for wide receiver, specifically this conversation, I'm
Mhm.
not interested in a trade up for Brian Thomas.
Mitch Brodeur comes in with a great comment. I'm not interested in the trade for Brian Thomas Jr. either, unless like he gets to like 25, 26. But even then, we don't have a third round pick. So unless we do something and start filling some holes in free agency, I'm really not going to feel comfortable. I want to have the first 4 picks that we have. I'd rather trade back, to be honest with you, because I think a lot of these other receivers are within the margin of error of Brian Thomas Jr. You can trade back, you can get 3 picks on day 2, have your 2 fourth-round picks, and you could feel a heck of a lot more comfortable filling some holes in the depth of your roster. Mitch Brodeur comes in with a great question, though. He says, what are your thoughts on using a first or a second round to trade up? Ideally, we're picking at the end of the first rounder next year. I would trade next year's first rounder if we could get up in the draft and take any one of the first 3. If we
Yes,
could,
I
if
agree
there
with that.
was I can't imagine there being a way, but if there was a way for us to get Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, or Romo Dunze on this football team, I would be willing to trade future assets, including a first round pick next year. I think it's going to take obviously way more than that. And I don't think there's any trade package that would make me feel comfortable with how far we'd have to move up, but it'd have to be a Julio Jones style trade up into the top 10. And I just can't envision a world where the Buffalo Bills are willing to do that. But if they did, I'd be all for it, because I think that I think all 3 of those guys are, I don't want to say generational, but like those 3 are like bona fide blue chip talents, in my opinion,
Mhm.
and they don't come around very often, or at least the Buffalo Bills don't find themselves in a position to get their hands on those guys very often.
Yeah, and I think that as we start now talking
Mhm.
about the second tier of guys, when you start talking about who could go in round one, and I love the way that you kind of like tab these guys, right? You could see
Mhm.
them all, you could see any one of them going in round one, but the floor being round two. And I think because of where the Bills are picking at 28, that group of like, let's call it
Mhm.
9 to 10 guys, I think after those top 3, if you're not making a move for those top 3, I could make a case for any 6 or 7 of those
Mhm.
guys next as being number 4 almost, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, like, if those guys are grouped so closely together and they're kind of head and shoulders below those
Mhm.
top 3, I mean, the Bills could have a choice of any one of those 6, 7 guys at pick 28.
So let's break down this next tier here. So this next tier I have, tier number 2. These are players that I think could easily go in the first round. A team will fall in love with one of these guys, take him in the first round. Heck, some of these guys might even be off the board before the Buffalo Bills pick at number 28.
Mhm.
But there's also, I think, a world in which some of these guys on this next list slip. But I don't see them slipping past the 62nd pick and getting out of the second round. Those players are Ladd McConkey out of Georgia, Adonai Mitchell out of Texas, Xavier Worthy out of Texas, Keon Coleman out of Florida State, and Xavier Legette out of the University of South Carolina. Obviously, Xavier Worthy is the speed guy. Ladd McConkey's that inside-outside, tested his short shuttle, his agility drills were Cooper Kupp type levels, and his other athletic testing was on par with the likes of a Garrett Wilson. So he's sort of breaking some stereotypes over the course of this pre-draft process and getting a lot of people on board with his game. And then you have the prototypical, possibly future X type of wide receivers in Adonai Mitchell, who a lot of people are comparing to Brian Thomas Jr. in terms of their raw, but they have the ability, high-end ability to be a X receiver. And then you got two other guys in Keon Coleman and Xavier Legette, who sort of are sort of these X type of receivers with these bigger bodies. What are your thoughts on tier 2? Like, who are the guys you feel comfortable taking at 28? Who are the guys that you don't?
Man, at 28, you know what? It's interesting. I think
because I don't think any of those guys get to 60. I don't.
To be honest, I could be convinced probably to take almost every one of those guys. The one guy that I might have some reservations taking at 28 would be Keon Coleman. I do think you can make a pretty strong case for any of the other 4.
Yeah.
I think McConkey may not even be there by 28, by the way.
Yeah,
So
it's starting to feel that way too. Like, I almost feel like maybe even he is surpassed with his short shuttle being like Cooper Kupp type level, and his 3-cone being like Cooper Kupp like, and his other testing being Garrett Wilson like. I think he might have even, in terms of like NFL front offices, usurped what AD Mitchell was able to do at the combine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, AD Mitchell, I know, Eric wasn't maybe as high on him. I really liked the games I watched of him. I thought he was really good at tracking the ball, and Ant's obviously done a good job cutting up some clips of him. Obviously, him and Worthy worked so well together at Texas, having those kind of opposite styles. Legette is a wild card to me, right? Because he was the one came out, broke out his very last year in college, but he was really the only guy they had to throw the ball to at South Carolina. So he was getting the best defenders or the most attention from opposing defenses all year long and delivered. And man, he gutted it out at the Senior Bowl practices. And when he gets the ball in his hands after the catch, it's something special to watch. And he's big and he's strong. And like I could be convinced to take him at 28 if the chips fell a certain way. And obviously we've talked a lot about Xavier Worthy over the past several weeks. I think for me, I could be convinced probably to take every one of those guys at 28, except for right now, I'm not convinced to take Keon Coleman at 28.
Yeah, I'm on board with you. Like, this is the year where I'm not going to let myself get upset by the Bills taking a receiver, because there really isn't a wide receiver in this draft class that I am like strongly opposed to. Last year, both of us were very vocally opposed to Quentin Johnson. We did not want Quentin Johnson, and we ended up being right. Like, that was not a great choice. I think I love Malachi Corley, the football player. Like, he's probably the closest I can get to maybe not wanting the Buffalo Bills to draft a guy, just because he kind of reminds me a little bit of like a souped up Curtis Samuel, where he's very much a Debo-ish type of get the ball in his hands in the short to intermediate and let him do work like Yak. And I just think we have Khalil Shakir for that. We have Curtis Samuel for that. I'm looking for guys who have made more plays down the football field than Malachi Corley has. That's not to say Malachi Corley can't do that. He just didn't do a lot of it in college. So there's really not a single guy. My argument for Keon Coleman is this. Him and Xavier Worthy are two of the younger players in this draft, right? So if you're looking at it from a future perspective, that by the time Keon Coleman hits his second contract, if you take him at 28, I think he's 25 or 26 years old. So he's still relatively young when he hits his second contract, as opposed to a guy like Xavier Legette, who is a 6th-year player, right? Ladd McConkey went through his full years of college as well. So they'll be older when they hit that second contract. A guy like Keon Coleman, a guy like Xavier Worthy, they're hitting the sweet spot. I just see Keon Coleman as a guy where the Buffalo Bills just look at him as more of a Gabriel Davis with Nas. Like, they just look at him like a more souped up, a more agile, a more bursty Gabriel Davis, because he's got the same body type. He can do similar things in terms of the way he, goes and attacks and high points the football, uses his body, boxes people out, all those various different things. Is he more of a possession receiver when we've all been sort of craving the speedy stretch The field guy, yes, he is. But just because, again, logically fans don't see the fit, I think that a lot of the NFL personnel, and especially a lot of Bills personnel, might see Keon Coleman's fit a lot more than fans do.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I'm
Mhm.
not convinced right now, but I can be convinced.
Yeah.
And like, it's a really good list. And I think again, what we were just kind of wrapped
Mhm.
talking about just really hits home the point for me again that I'm not really interested in trading up from
Yeah.
28.
No, I agree because, like, the difference between Brian Thomas Jr. and AD Mitchell to me is minimal. Would I prefer Brian Thomas Jr.? Yeah. But when would I prefer Brian Thomas Jr. and all the assets that we might have to go up and go get him? That's where I start to lose a little bit of sleep. So let's take a look at tier 3 here. These are guys who I think are going to be second round picks, or at the very worst, I don't think they escape the third round. I think they are drafted before the second day of the draft is over. And I feel pretty comfortable and confident saying that. The receivers are Ricky Pearsall out of Florida, who's entering a lot of people's top 50 lists now. Roman Wilson from Michigan, who's also entering a lot of people's top 50 lists now. Troy Franklin, who the Buffalo Bills are going to have a private workout with, who was sick during the combine. He put his weight back on into the mid 180s, and apparently he had a very, very good pro day. So Troy Franklin, very much on the board. Malachi Corley, who skipped the combine. So it's going to be really interesting to see when his pro day comes up, what he does, because he relied a lot on what he did at the Senior Bowl. Jalen Polk, the wide receiver 2 out of Washington, and personal favorite of this podcast, Javon Baker, who I think is going to go higher and above some of the wide receivers that maybe we expect to go before them. There are a couple of receivers in here, mainly Roman Wilson, who, with the Chiefs picking at 32, like, I think that a couple of those receivers, even Ricky Pearsall, could be in play to be like shocking type of first round picks. But I'm not willing to go there yet. But that's my tier 3 guys who I think will go sometime in the second or the third round. These are guys who are likely in play for the Bills at 60, or they might have to make a minor trade up for. It's a
Mhm.
pretty good list of wide receivers too. Like, so for the people who are out there, and I think we missed a super chat, and I want to go back to it, and I do apologize for missing it. Thank you. So Scott Vanaloo, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate it. He says, "Hey guys, in your opinion, with 2 wide receivers we got in free agency plus the ones we got on the roster, do you think we should go wide receiver in the first round or go cornerback or safety?" I don't think we go cornerback safety in the first round, but I think with the depleted defensive line that we have, we could go edge rusher in the first round if one of the top 3 guys falls to us. We could have one of the better interior defensive linemen fall to us at pick number 28. And then we can go and we could attack the receiver position in the second round. So I think, Scott, you are onto something. And if you look at the names of those wide receivers, it's not the end of the world if we do not take a wide receiver in the first round.
Yeah, Javon Baker has been on kind of my love list for a while now since I started my
Mm-hmm.
process for this year. What it really shows you with that group of guys is like, yeah, they are a little bit of a notch
Mm-hmm.
below. You could even see maybe Pearsall being a guy that sneaks into maybe a floor of this being the second round. I
Mm-hmm.
like what you're saying. Like, I don't like it because the Chiefs are going to get somebody good potentially, but the Chiefs are going to be in position to get
Mm-hmm.
a really good wide receiver if they choose to do so with their pick. Um, this is the game you play if you're the Bills, right? Because with wide receiver being we name those, you name those guys. I like really a lot of those guys: Roman Wilson, Javon
Mm-hmm.
Baker, Pearsall, probably my 3 favorites on that particular grouping. Do you play a little bit of chicken here if you're the Bills and maybe go away from wide receiver in the first round and just know with that
Mm-hmm.
group of whatever 15 to 20 guys that we have on this list right here, that one of those guys, right, makes it to pick 60? Are you willing to take that risk knowing that you really probably could find a fit for any one of these guys that are on this list if
Mm-hmm.
you take them, if any one of those guys makes it to pick 60? I think that's the challenge if you're Brandon Beane is the patience, right? If you don't decide to take a receiver in the first round, knowing that you probably still need to add another young
Mm-hmm.
talent to this group, how long are you willing to wait in that second round before you start to get a trigger finger and potentially
Yeah.
start talking about future years picks or
Mm-hmm.
a package of picks to move up
Yeah.
could be only a matter of like 10 spots, right, in the second round.
That's why it gets stressful, right? And that's why
Yeah.
you start to get antsy because the Buffalo Bills, listen, there's a list of 15 guys here that we as fans all like for the most part. That doesn't mean the Buffalo Bills like them all or see them all as a fit. I sort of talked at the top of the show. I think the Buffalo Bills could fall in love with Roman Wilson. His inside outside flex, I think he's just a slightly smaller Amon-Ra St. Brown type. He's got the speed to play on the boundary and to stretch people. He just gets after it in the run game. He's a high character guy. Like, I think Roman Wilson is a guy the Buffalo Bills could absolutely fall for. Troy Franklin, we've had this conversation about Troy Franklin before. My misgivings with Troy Franklin is I don't think he's a future number one. And I would like the receiver that we take in this draft to be the future number one. But that's not to say that Troy Franklin cannot be a super important football player to this team. You put him on the boundary and he can stretch the field vertically, and that opens up so much underneath. And that takes maybe the safety away from Stephon Diggs. And as I mentioned, takes the underneath, opens up the underneath for James Cook and Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir and Dalton Kincaid. So Troy Franklin adds an element that I don't think we have on this roster right now, unless you want to use Curtis Samuel in that role, and that is to stretch the field. So Troy Franklin, I think, really becomes an uber important guy, even though he doesn't have that future X receiver potential. And then one of my favorites in this process, outside of Javon Baker, who you've already talked about, I love Jalen Polk, and I think he goes untalked about. In fact, I'm starting to see a lot of shade thrown at Jalen Polk. They're like, "Oh, Jalen McMillan's better." I don't get the Jalen Polk pipe. Jalen Polk to me is a faster Jacoby Myers. He's just so technically sound. He can high point. He can do what you want to do in the run game. He can play on the boundary. I don't think he sizzles. And again, I think his ceiling is wide receiver number 2. I don't think you're going to get a wide receiver number 1 out of him. But if he could be a slightly faster Jacoby Myers, that's his ceiling in the National Football League. Sign me up for that, because we wanted Jacoby Myers something fierce in free agency last year when we were doing our free agency preview shows. So there are a ton of options for the Buffalo Bills here.
I like Polk. I think honestly, out of that group on that list, like Corley to
Mm-hmm.
me, as much as I love
Mm-hmm.
Corley as a player, I just don't love, again, the Bills could go out and be like, screw it, we're going to get a bunch of guys that operate around the line of scrimmage, and they
Mm-hmm.
could go out and they could fall in love with Malachi Corley. But he is a at the line of scrimmage yak type of guy. Yes, he's
Mm-hmm.
awesome in the run game as far as blocking, but he doesn't open up the field for you like a Troy Franklin would. He doesn't
Mm-hmm.
open up the field for you like a Pearsall would. Um, and so that's where like my only reservation is with a guy like Corley, because he was obviously a monster in college and
Mm-hmm.
uber productive, but a lot of that was after the catch. And I just worry, like, we have Samuel who operates a lot around the line of scrimmage. You have Diggs
Mm-hmm.
really who operates a lot around the line of scrimmage. Cook, Kincaid. How much of this are you going to have around the line of scrimmage or in the intermediate areas? You
Mm-hmm.
do need someone to go down the field. And that's why for me, I think out of that group, Corley would probably be last on my list, but I
Mm-hmm.
do like him. I think he's going to be a great fit somewhere.
So let's move on now to tier 4. And the interesting thing about tier 4 is these are wide receivers that I think could go in the 3rd round. So they could be day 2 picks. Or I think at worst, they hear their name called early on day number 3, early in the 4th round. And I've done a lot of calculating over the last couple of weeks in creating these tiers. I've calculated the 3-year average on the total number of wide receivers taken. I did the research on how many receivers were taken in the first 3 rounds of the past 3 drafts. So I go back 3 years with all of mine because the NFL is ever changing. Like, I posted a list of like undrafted free agent wide receivers that I think guys who aren't going to get drafted. People are like, well, no, this guy's going to get drafted here. This guy's going to go in this round. Only so many wide receivers are going to get drafted. Like, there are probably 40, 45 good receivers in this draft, and only like 30 to 35 of them are going to get drafted. There are 25 like legit receivers that we probably all love in this draft. Only like 14 to 17 or 18 of them are going to go in the first 3 rounds. So there could legitimately be someone waiting for us in the 4th round if we so chose. There could be someone there, but that is risky business. And that's what makes this next tier so wild, because we don't have a 3rd round pick. So this is either the Buffalo Bills are getting crazy and they're double dipping, or the Buffalo Bills are, in fans' opinion, getting reckless and waiting too long to take a wide receiver. That's what this next tier is, because I find it hard to believe any of these guys would be there by our picks in the 4th round. But these are guys who our options in round 3 if we maybe wanted to trade up into the 3rd round, but then there goes all the late picks that we have. My tier number 4 is Jalen McMillan out of the University of Washington, Jermaine Burton out of Alabama, Malik Washington out of Washington, Tez Walker out of UNC, Jamari Thrash out of Louisville, and Johnny Wilson out of Florida State University. And me and you have both discussed how we are not really big fans of Johnny Wilson in terms of his fit with the Buffalo Bills. But what do you think about that list of wide receivers? And I don't know, man, like I would love them all as double dips. If you could tell me Jalen McMillan was available to us in the 4th round, I would be okay with not drafting a wide receiver early, but you can't make that guarantee right now. And I highly doubt that that's a possibility.
Yeah, I know Jalen McMillan, some of the biggest hands in the draft, obviously tested well athletically at the combine, 9.33 RAS, 6th best 3-cone of all wide receivers at the combine. So that Washington group was really impressive. And we'll find out this year probably whether it was the receiving group that made Penix or if it was him making them, right? But Jalen McMillan is an intriguing name on that list. I think the more I think about this kind of tier 4-ish type of range, it really makes me upset that the Bills don't have a 3rd round pick, because I really feel like if the Bills had gotten that 3rd round comp pick, this would be so much less stressful. Number one, you potentially could get a guy in the 3rd round that's on this list. You don't have a 3rd rounder. Number two, you could have maybe traded a 3rd rounder to move up in the 1st round, potentially, right? To move up to get a guy, or to move up maybe even in the 2nd round, several spots, like 15 to 20 spots, right? But you don't have it. So again, this is one of those situations where it's a waiting game for Brandon Beane. How many of these guys make it to the 4th round? Probably a couple of them do, right? Probably a couple of them do, but we just don't know which ones they are. And at this point in the draft, you start getting more, you start moving more towards the niche guys, like guys that can do 1 or 2 things really well. And you have to really find a fit for these guys. And you have to have really a specific plan for these guys coming into your team. So Tez Walker is obviously a kind of a polarizing name on that list, because there's a lot of different opinions about him. Obviously, Mack Hollins from UNC, a lot of guys from UNC come through as wide receivers in recent years, but a lot of different opinions on him as well. So this is a tough range for me because of the lack of pick we have in the 3rd round.
And because you got to think about it too, like Gabriel Davis was a 4th round pick. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown was a 4th round pick. We never thought Khalil Shakir was going to last into the 5th round in his draft year. And the Buffalo Bills moved up to get Khalil Shakir in the 5th round. There are a lot of interesting names on this list. Like if you're the Buffalo Bills and you're like, all right, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get an impact defensive lineman round 1. I'm going to go get my safety round 2. And then with my other 9 picks, I'm going to package them to move up into the 3rd round or the top of the 4th round to grab one of these wide receivers. I can get the appeal of some of these receivers. Jalen McMillan, 6'1", 197, 32-inch arms, 10-inch hands. You mentioned some of the bigger hands in this draft. 4'4", 40. He's got the body of a boundary guy, but he's played primarily in the slot at Washington. So maybe the Buffalo Bills look at a guy like Jalen McMillan and they're like, well, he did this in college, but he can do way more in the pros. And Jalen McMillan has a fan club. So if we can go out and get an impact defensive lineman in round 1, we can get an impact safety, plug and play starting safety in round 2. And then we can package picks into the 3rd round or the top of the 4th round and get Jalen McMillan. You know, William Conlon comes in and says, Bill's Twitter will explode. Yes. If our first 2 picks are not a wide receiver, Bill's Twitter will explode. But if we can work our way back up into the draft and get a guy like Jalen McMillan, all of a sudden, man, you get an impact defensive lineman, you get an impact safety, and you get an impact wide receiver with your first 3 picks. All guys plug and all guys play early. I think fans, once the season starts, have a way different opinion of the way the Buffalo Bills approach this draft. Jermaine Burton can maybe do the same exact things Troy Franklin can do. Maybe the ceiling isn't as high, right? But he can do the same exact things. Tez Walker, man, that one is just so polarizing because I can see the Buffalo Bills absolutely falling in love with Tez Walker, his size, his speed, his athleticism, all of it. And I can see the Buffalo Bills saying, let's get him some real coaching. Let's get him some NFL coaching. The intangibles are there. We don't need to rush him because we got Curtis Samuel and we got Khalil Shakir and we got Mack Hollins. He can just be a part of a rotation. He can grow with this receiving group, and he's got X receiver athleticism. He's got X receiver ceiling. I can see the Buffalo Bills being a lot higher on Tez Walker than us fans are. And Bills Are Electric comes in with the big issue. Too bad Tez can't catch. He had an awful Senior Bowl when it came to ball tracking, getting under some of those deep balls, high pointing those deep balls, etc. But if you look at his advanced analytics, his drop rate and stuff in college is really not that bad.
No, and I mean, obviously, he had the monster testing numbers, the 9.86 RAS. He's got the size, like you mentioned, for that prototypical X. He's got the downfield ability, averaged 17 yards per catch in 8 games with Carolina last year, had the 7 receiving TDs, caught 10 of 17 contested targets last year for PFF. Anything really in that 50 to 60% range of contested catch receptions is pretty good. Only 3 drops they charge him for on the whole season. So he's got a good tracking ability. Yeah. What is his route running repertoire going to look like, though? I think is the big question people have. Is he going to be kind of that downfield strider, that downfield post type of route runner, or can he add more? Or do you even need him to add more at this stage, which I think is a good point, that is a good counterpoint to that. Like, maybe you don't need him to do more than that. Maybe he can be like a cheaper version of a Troy Franklin if you're so inclined to do that and he's there in the 4th round. Although I think with his athletic profile, someone will probably take a chance on him in that 3rd, 4th round range, like where you have him. So I think that's a good spot for him.
Malik Washington, same athletic profile pretty much as Zay Flowers. Now, Zay Flowers did a lot more down the field in college than what Malik Washington was asked to do, but Malik Washington had an absolutely incredible Shrine Bowl. He was the talk of the Shrine Bowl, just like Zay Flowers was the talk of the Shrine Bowl. So if there's anyone who I'm wrong about in this, Malik Washington could be it. Like, Malik Washington can go in the 2nd or the 3rd round, and I wouldn't bat an eye, because he has, like I said, the same exact athletic profile as Zay Flowers, blew up the Shrine Bowl. And I think a lot of people are sleeping on Jamari Thrash as well. Oh, he's smaller. 5'11", 188 pounds. That's pretty rocked up for 5'11". Ran a 4.46 He's got 31-inch arms. He does have smaller hands in the 8-inch range. But Jamari Thrash, I know he didn't have the greatest Senior Bowl, but the Senior Bowl isn't the end-all be-all. You throw on some of that Louisville tape, and a lot of the guys that break down film, they love what they saw out of Jamari Thrash as well. Like, this draft is so friggin' deep at wide receiver. So let's get into the next tier as well. This is definitely, we better be double dipping by this point. Like, we better be double dipping by this point. And that is the 4th or the 5th round guys. Again, the way I have these guys tiered, this group, these are guys who I think will go in the 4th or the 5th round. Their ceiling being the 4th round, their floor being, I don't think they'll be around after the end of the 5th round. So these are sort of players that fall into this category. Anthony Gould, the smaller, pint-sized return man / wide receiver from Oregon State, son of Jerry Rice, Brendan Rice, who I was tempted to put higher, but just because of the sheer number and the sheer volume of wide receivers and his lack of production in college, I put him in this tier. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes sooner. Another guy I wouldn't be surprised goes sooner, Luke McCaffrey. Obviously, he's got the McCaffrey name, converted quarterback to wide receiver. His game is still growing. He impressed a lot of people at the Senior Bowl, and he's a pretty darn good athlete with a boundary type of body, even though right now he's more of a big slot. You got Taj Washington, who I think is a lot like Quez Watkins, a guy who he can go out there and he can just shoot you down you can shoot him down the field and stretch the field with him. You have Jalen Coker, the small school prospect, and you have Jacob Cowing, who has a ton of fans. He produced big time in college, the slot receiver out of Arizona. So a really good list of wide receivers. But if we're talking about this being the 5th addition to the Buffalo Bills wide receiver room after Diggs, Shakir, Samuel, and Mack Hollins, people are going to be pretty upset.
I mean, you're probably right about that, but there's some guys with some upside there. Rice, obviously, he I think over the course of the process has gained more fans just from people
Hmm.
turning on and like really turning on to see like what type of player he is and not like and maybe getting rid of some of their preconceived notions about who he is as a player.
Hmm.
I like what David says here. That's kind of exactly what I'm talking about here, overlooking him because they have these notions about what he is, but when they actually watch the games and see what he can do on tape, he's actually a more polished player than people
Hmm.
maybe give him credit for. Good hands, and he's a good blocker as well. So that group is a very different, like each guy is a little different. You
Hmm.
have some smaller guys in that group with Cowing, you have some bigger guys with Rice, and then you have some in between as well. You're probably right though. I think that
Yeah.
if the Bills make one of these guys their first wide receivers that they select in this draft,
Hmm.
you're probably going to have some people that are not going to be too happy. However, with that said, we wouldn't know what the Bills may have picked with their
Hmm.
first round pick, their second round pick, maybe even
Hmm.
their fourth round pick, right? If these guys are in that kind of fifth round range. So reserve judgment if the rest of the draft maybe
Yeah.
goes swimmingly
And
well. So
and I'll tell you what, too. I like Joe Mannix. Like I like Brendan Rice, but Brendan Rice does remind me a lot of Gabriel Davis because I do think Brendan Rice is pretty stiff as well. But again, I just want to brace people, right? Like we could live in a world, and John Calvin says what happened to McMillan, not even 600 yards last year. He was hurt. If you go back and you put his tape from 2 years ago, that's why people are really high on Jalen McMillan. He played last year hurt, so that's McMillan. But I, I just want to brace people, right? Like we could live in a world where the Bills are pretty solidly content with Diggs, Samuel, and Shakir because they feel like they have other needs that need to be addressed. We literally don't have enough defensive linemen to field a game day roster right now. And we obviously, I think most people would gather that we need another safety. Things can change in free agency, right? I can envision a world, and I think Bills fans need to brace for a world where the Buffalo Bills feel like there's a receiver they can get on day 3 of the draft with one of those fourth round picks where they feel like they can platoon that player with Mack Hollins and they can get by with Diggs, Samuel, Shakir, and a platoon of Hollins and say Brendan Rice in the fourth round.
I know, and like
There's a world where that exists. There's a world where that could happen.
is it worth it? I guess is the question to Bills fans. Like at that point, like
Mhm.
you need a receiver, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, is it like you still have to take one? So it's like, at what point do you say, well, we might as well keep waiting and waiting because
Mhm.
like I don't really see much of a difference between Brendan Rice and another guy that we're going to talk about here. Um, like in the next tier, right? Like maybe we don't
Mhm.
think there's a difference between these. Like that's where I think where is the cutoff or the drop off for you in the comment section? Where's the drop off for you for like if we don't get sort of a guy within this range, when does it kind of stop mattering to
Mhm.
you when we get the guy?
I'm more lenient than I think other people because, like, if we come out of this draft with Jalen McMillan, I'm higher on Jalen McMillan than most. If we come out of this draft with like Jermaine Burton, but we absolutely slayed our first 2 picks. If we come out of this one with like Jamari Thrash, but we slayed our first 2 picks. If we come out of it with Brendan Rice as our number first receiver taken, but we slayed the first 2 picks. Like if we absolutely like lay the lumber and get 2 impact players in the first 2 picks, like guys that I feel comfortable are going to be impact players.
Hmm.
I personally won't lose sleep if our first receiver isn't taken to the fourth round. I just know other people will. And who knows, maybe there's a world where I'm I'm misreading Javon Baker. I think Javon Baker doesn't get out of day 2. I maybe there's a world where Javon Baker is the simulators are right. Javon Baker's there in the fourth round. I
Yeah.
don't I don't think I he's one of those ones where every year I say the simulator's wrong and I'm usually right about that. He's one of the guys this year where I'm like the simulator's wrong. The simulator is broken. Javon Baker's going sooner than people think. So it, if we absolutely like add an impact defensive lineman and impact safety, and then Javon Baker or Brendan Rice or Jamari Thrash or Jalen McMillan is our pick in the fourth round, like I don't think I'd lose sleep over that. I know some people will. Some people will. I don't think I
Hmm.
would. Um, I think Brendan Rice would probably be my. And there are other guys in front of Brendan Rice on these tier lists. Like Anthony Gould is a slot guy. I'm not like I would lose my mind. Johnny Wilson, I would lose my mind, right? Like Tez Walker, like Malik Washington, maybe too much similar to some of the other guys. But like McMillan, Burton, all those guys, like I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I really wouldn't, because I think that's just how historically awesome and stacked this class is. Like there's so many good receivers.
Well, I think we found your cutoff point then.
I think
It's right in that.
my point is Brendan Rice.
Yeah, I think we did find it.
I
So
wouldn't be jump for joy happy, but I also wouldn't lose sleep over it. Like that's pretty much where my level is. Looking at some of the late day 3 guys, this is definitely where it needs to be double dip. Jaquan Jackson out of Tulane. He's a guy who has a lot of fans. Aeneas Smith, who's got some return flex, former running back out of Texas A&M. 3 guys that I really like who have some size and have some speed. Ryan Flournoy out of Southeastern Missouri State, huge riser from the Senior Bowl and the Combine. Cornelius Johnson, who gives me Donovan Peoples-Jones vibes, underutilized at Michigan, but's got size, has got speed. Jordan Whittington, the big slot out of Texas. Marcus Roseme Jack Saint out of Georgia, who has got a really good athletic profile, kind of like the Justin Shorter of this year's class. Really good athletic profile. Played at a big time school, just didn't really deliver statistics. And then another guy that a lot of people love in Bub Means, size, speed, sort of flyer there. Again, just kind of like Justin Shorter was in the 5th round last year. But these guys are more late day 3 now because of just how stacked this class is. But double dip. Flournoy and Johnson, I would love if the Buffalo Bills double dipped with one of those guys. It would just give us more boundary bodies to compete. It would give us more speed on the edge to compete. I think a guy like Cornelius Johnson has some special teams value as sort of like a gunner and stuff too. So I really like some of even the late round flyers in this draft.
yeah, Jack Saint's interesting to me as well because of his athletic profile. Obviously, he caught the touchdown in the Senior Bowl game, but like you look at him, he's got like
Mhm.
long arms, big hands. Um, didn't necessarily get to be the focal point of that offense right at Georgia, but 6'1", 205, like he's got that maybe ability to come in and be like your sort of Justin Shorter, like you said, of this year. But again,
Mhm.
at that point, it's like, well, you already have Justin Shorter. So what are you doing really at this stage in the draft? So I think at this stage in the draft, you're looking for, if at this point you're going to double dip, right? You're looking for maybe a guy with return ability or maybe a guy with
Mhm.
some special traits, right? That can help you, um, with some gadget type plays, something like that, right? But
Mhm.
I think I'm firmly with you at this point. Like it would have to be a double dip scenario. And I think like that's okay for me if we take guys with some redundant skill sets this
Mhm.
late because you're still trying to find the best 6 to make this team potentially probably not going to be 7, probably going to
Mhm.
be 6. And right now we really only probably have 4 guys that we truly can count on. So the more that you add to that sort of
Mhm.
bottom tier depth of the depth chart to kind of compete with each other, I think the better off you're going to be.
We got Adam L coming in saying, so in order to get a wide receiver, D lineman, and safety in the first 3 rounds, we have to trade back. I could no, like, so I think there are 2 paths. The first path is trading back, which I think would be really cool. Like if we get 2 picks in the 2nd round, a pick in the 3rd round, and then 2 picks in the 4th round, we're cooking. We are
Mhm.
cooking, right?
Yep.
So if you get a team that really wants to come up for Bo Nix or Michael Penix or one of those, Spencer Rattler maybe even sneaks into the 1st round, who knows? There are some quarterback need teams out there. If there's someone who really wants to move up into the 1st round, they're willing to go up a 2nd or 3rd rounder or a 2nd or 4th rounder. The Buffalo Bills can then have 2 seconds, and then they can use the 4th rounders to move back up into the 3rd round, or they could have the 3rd round pick, etc. So there are a number of things the Buffalo Bills can do to accumulate some day 3 draft, or some day 2, draft picks. Right now they only have 1. Um, like I said, you can play around with the simulators. You can make trades left and right. You're going to get a lot of talent because really the difference between the player at 28 and a player at 45 in this draft is it's not very different. You're essentially drafting in the 2nd round most years when you have the 20th overall pick. And that's why it's been pretty impressive that for the most part, Brandon Beane's been able to hit on a lot of these 1st round picks, minus obviously Kyrie Young.
And look, the book is not closed on Kyrie Elam yet. And on that note, yeah, I think
Mhm.
I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. A couple of guys who didn't make our list here, but they could be priority free agents. They could slip into the later rounds of the draft. Isaiah Williams had a really good Shrine Bowl. He didn't run the greatest 40 at the combine, but he cleaned it up at his pro day and had really good agility drill times. Joshua Cephas was one of the major, I think, combine snubs out of UTSA. He's a bigger bodied wide receiver. Tawan Palmer out of UAB is an absolute athletic freak. Like, UAB was not fun to watch this year because they were bad, but this guy's 6'2", 210 pounds. He had a 2.1% drop rate, huge catch radius, and just speed. He's kind of like a Xavier Leggett flyer type of guy. Like if you're at the end of the draft and you're looking for like a very, very unpolished Xavier Leggett type, a guy like Tawan Palmer out of UAB fits the bill. And you obviously got Leatrick Griffin, another one of these smaller slot type of guys out of Mississippi State. Xavier Weaver from Colorado as his fans. Casey Washington from Illinois, from Illinois as his fans. Jenke, Drake Stoops. I mean, all these guys, Devin Carter, a lot of these guys, Hayden Hatton. You will find fans of these guys in the draft community. Any number of these guys could go in the 6th or the 7th round. It wouldn't shock me. But again, I put like 34, 35 guys on my board, and that's usually on average how many wide receivers are taken a year. So a lot of these guys that you maybe think are 6th or 7th round picks, they're going to be priority free agents. And the Buffalo Bills will probably add a couple of guys of that nature as well to round out their room and come in and compete in training camp. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. This was a great exercise. Had a lot of fun. Like I said, the schedule here is a little wonky. We'll always be on Monday nights at 9. We will always be on Monday nights at 9, whether it's live or pre-recorded. We will always be Monday at 9. That is our time slot. But sometimes we will go Sunday nights live like we are tonight, or Thursday night after Buffalo late night in the 9 p.m. slot. We were going to try to do two shows a week up until the draft because there's a lot of content to cover, but it could either be Sunday, Monday, or Monday, Thursday, depending on the week. And we will try to keep you as informed as possible. Follow us on X. That's where we relay most of our information at the Bills guys, but it was a lot of fun, guys. I really do hope the Buffalo Bills take a wide receiver with one of their first 2 picks, or they trade up and make sure one of their first 3 picks in the first 2 days, they get a wide receiver. But this has been a fun exercise, and we'll be back tomorrow night at 9 p.m. to do the same exact thing with edge rushers.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the edge rusher discussion because I think it could really be a big priority for the Bills in this draft with having only those first and second round picks. Like, man, and look, Von Miller, we don't know what he's going to come back to be this year. Obviously, it was awesome to get AJ Vanessa back in the mix, but the room is thin, my friend. The room is thin.
All right. We will see you tomorrow night, 9 p.m. when we break down edge rushers. And Dave, until next time, go Bills.
Go Bills.
Thank you for watching tonight's episode of the Air Raid Hour. Make sure to hit that like button on the way out. If you are catching the show on demand, leave a reply in the comments section and we will respond over the course of the week. You can always listen to every episode next day on all major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify, by searching Air Raid Buffalo. Thank you for your continued support, and as always, go Bills!